Hi, my name is Claire Blacketer, and I'm going to be taking you through this portion of the OMOP CDM and vocabulary tutorial. We're going to start off with a refresher of the tables in the CDM. We're going to go through some common myths and misconceptions about the CDM, and then we're going to go through some common issues and errors that you might face. All right, so just as a reminder, these are the different domains that are present in OMOP CDM version 6. You'll see we have the standardized clinical data on the left-hand side, and as you would have seen in your prerequisite videos, this is a person-centric model. So you see person up here at the top left, and it links to all of the different clinical data tables, as well as some in the health system data as well. We've got some standardized derived elements where we create eras around how long someone might have a condition, how long and they might be exposed to a drug ingredient, that sort of thing. And then we've got some health economics tables, and you see the vocabularies right here on the right-hand side, which is really the backbone of the model and how we can fully standardize and implement network studies across our huge international network. So as a reminder, the CDM is patient-centric, as I mentioned, and we standardize both the structure and content of the model. So that means the data model, the tables and fields, as well as the vocabulary, meaning we all use SNOMEDs for diagnoses, we use RX norms for drugs, and we specify which tables they need to go in, so we always know where to find certain codes and conditions and procedures and drugs and measurements. We accommodate data from many different sources, so not only claims, but we've seen data from registries do very well in the OMOP CDM, as well as EHR and many other different health data sources. We do preserve the data provenance and source data, so as you should have seen in the video, every table contains fields that have the source data in them. So even if they may not get a mapping to a standard concept, we retain all that source data. It is extendable and evolving. We are constantly adding or removing depending on use cases that come up in the community. And we are platform independent, so you can use whichever platform best suits your needs. In terms of version control, we do have a working group that meets once a month to discuss proposed changes. And if you end up coming, you'll see me quite a bit there as well. I help to run that working group and manage the different versions of the CDM as they come through. We've got all of our documentation available on GitHub at the link there, and you'll receive all this information through the course today. And so don't feel like you need to memorize everything right here, but we've also got lots of proposals and issues out on GitHub, and you can find our meeting information on the wiki page. All right, so let's talk through some common myths of the CDM that we hear quite often from folks who might be new or maybe have heard some things about the OMOP CDM that aren't quite true. All right, we've got 6 different myths we're going to go through today. Myth number 1, we hear a lot of times that people believe they're going to lose data when they convert to the common data model, especially the OMOP CDM, because we force a vocabulary standard as well as a structural standard. But really, as I said before, we preserve all source data within the CDM, even if no mapping exists. And we have standard conventions that enforce certain rules, like people without years of birth, people without gender, maybe people whose IDs have been reused. And really all we're trying to do is remove some of those things that might trip up an analyst if they weren't to look for them. And we're trying to provide people with a really nice, ready to go analytic level data set. And now for all those different ETL conventions and user guidance, you can find that on our website at odyssey.github.io/common data model. Myth number 2, a lot of people believe that the OMOP CDM will cause their data to be of either lesser quality or that we don't actually look into the data quality very well, and we assume that it is of quality once it's been converted, but we don't look into it. But we actually do have quite a lot of different data quality checks that we do, as well as lots of characterization that has been done, and those packages are all available open source to you. The data quality dashboard, which is seen up here, runs 3,300 different checks against an OMOP CDM instance. And then we also have the Achilles package, which runs a full set of characterization studies across the board for every different concept and field that exists in the CDM. So oftentimes too, we hear that moving data from a native source to the OMOP standard might degrade the accuracy of the data. But really many different validation studies have been done to show that this just really isn't true. As I mentioned before, we might remove people with erroneous years of birth or genders that don't make sense, but those things should be happening at the time of analysis anyway. We're just taking that next step. So when you start to do some of these studies between the native and the CDM, we find that they tie out almost 100% of the time. There's also some concern about the vocabulary mappings being incorrect. But again, studies have found minimal difference in the source to OMOP data, and an EMA validation study of the IQVIA IMRD UK database found consistency between source and the OMOP CDM data. So the concern, there's really not much there. If you have some concerns about the vocabulary, you can always, there's lots of different ways to get information from the forums to the GitHub to contacting any OHDSI collaborator, and they'll be happy to help you with any questions or concerns you might have. And there's some concern about taking data from the source format to the OMOP Common Data Model, that it can be tedious and time consuming, and that there is some, resourcing involved, and that is true. You do have to put in more time up front. You do have to spend the time to make sure you're making the correct choices during your ETL, and that you're, putting data in the correct domains based on its vocabulary. And it is a little bit more time to set up, but once you're there, your studies execute so much faster. You can participate in network research, and you can leverage the entire catalog of OHDSI tools and resources that are available to you, and that really saves a lot more time than the time that's necessary up front. All right, myth number 5. The OMOP CDM does not support all analytical use cases, or it doesn't cover the therapeutic area that I want to study. And that's very true. That has happened before. A really good example is oncology data. A couple years ago, there were some intrepid OHDSI collaborators that felt that oncology data was not well represented in the OMOP CDM. They got a work group together, they solved the problem, they created 2 new tables, and now they are being held up as one of the best examples of a working group in OHDSI because they got it done. They came up with a proposal, and we were able to make changes to the CDM to support their needs. So it's really not unheard of, and we really want to hear those use cases so we can continue to evolve and make the CDM better. Again, here's my example for oncology. So the OMOP CDM doesn't support your use case. Well, now we're supporting a lot of different things with cancer that we weren't supporting before based on this large group of people that got together. All right, there is also, we've heard before, oh, I don't want to learn new terms. I'm used to, read codes or ICD-9 or whatever, and OMOP makes me talk in SNOMED, RxNorm, and LOINC. Now that is true. We do make any OMOP collaborator. You do need to convert your data and map your data from whatever your source codes are to our standard codes. But it's been done for you. The mappings exist in the vocabulary. The hierarchies exist in the vocabulary. So all you have to do is look up your source code in the vocabulary, and it's almost that easy. You don't have to create these mappings yourselves. It's all been done, and you just have to leverage that work that's been provided to you. All right, and I'm going to hand it over to Mui to talk through some common issues that we see in the CDM.
All right, thank you, Claire. Hi, my name is Mui Van Sant. I work for IQVIA, and we deal with a lot of different data conversions. I'm going to talk to you guys today about some of the more common issues that you may run into within the CDM, either during a conversion or after when you're doing research with the data. So here's a list of some of the common stuff. Now there's a lot more than this, but just a high-level list of some of the things that you might run into, right? One of the problems that you've heard in some of the other classes is this non-standard vocabulary, where you have data or medical terms that aren't mapped to any of our vocabularies that's already in the OMOP system. So then you're going to have to map them yourself. Okay, we have this multiple record for one concept mapping. And in some of the exercises, you may have already run into this, where you have one source code that maps to more than one standard code, and what do you do with that? Another one that is very common is a lot of people don't really understand the type concept ID as well, so they pick the wrong type concept ID, or they don't even fill it in. Then we have the multiple input records, where within your source system, you may have multiple fields that can represent a code, or you have multiple records that then get merged into one record in the OMOP CDM. We have lots of abnormal values, especially within your measurement table. You have a lot of negative values in there, or 0.0001 for a drug when it comes to quantity. Right? We have tables that are missing because not everybody understands that which tables to always have to populate. Sometimes, especially like the error tables, we get that a lot where folks forget to populate those. Then we have this non-clinical event one, which is also very common, where you get values like Tuesday, or it says confirmed. They're not exactly very necessary for our clinical research. We have incorrect logic for both the observation period and the visit occurrence, because those are typically derived. So there's typically problems when people have when they're trying to derive them. Okay, we're not going to walk through every single one of these. I'm just going to go through a few of these to show you what the problem is and how you may be able to solve it. Okay. The first one is non-standard vocabulary. This can result from text fields or duplicate or unclear values. It happens in the US a lot with ICD-9 and ICD-10 codes, especially during the transition time between ICD-9 to ICD-10. You may have a code in there that says it's ICD-9, but the value actually is ICD-10. So what do you do with that, right? And it also happens a lot when you have proprietary coding systems. Like a lot of EHRs have their own proprietary system that is not, especially like for procedure codes or lab values, as well as the standard is not in the Athena. So a lot of countries that we have not worked with yet, their coding system may not be in there, right? So what do? There are really two solutions. One, you can have your own mapping team and do what we call custom mapping, which you have learned in the session when we were talking about concept mapping. And they can do that and either use the concept to source the concept mapping table or the to be in series. The other one is to work with the vocabulary team to prioritize the list and get them in. So for example, in China, we spent the time working, the China OHDSI group has been spending time working with the OHDSI team to get ICD-10 into the Athena as a vocabulary, a source vocabulary, okay, and mapping all that. So the second issue is the wrong type of concept IDs used. This happens a lot. Like I said, folks, when they first do an OMOP CDM conversion, they don't really know very well what that field is for. Number one, we are working on that by providing more instructions inside the wiki, which Claire pointed you to. But the second way, what you need to do is actually go into Athena and look up the type and the standard, and you'll get all of them. One thing I do want to put out there is that the type does not always have to be as the same domain as the record itself. So you can have an observation, the type that's from a condition, because the code originally came from the condition table, okay? The third one is abnormal values. So we get this, again, quite a lot. You have negative values, you have zero values, you have decimals, you have nulls. There's a lot of cleaning that you have to do when you move something over to the OMOP CDM. And you have to check all that. We have in Achilles and the data quality dashboard, some of those checks already, like the negative values for measurements. There are only certain concepts where we allow for negative values in measurements. And if it's not one of those, then we fail that, that test, okay? Now, if you have some that you know are negative, but they don't exist in our checks already, let us know, we'll add them, right? So you really have to make sure you check and clean up your data so it makes sense for those who are doing the research. The last one I'm going to cover here is missing CDM tables. So again, there are tables that typically can be missing. Some folks don't think they have cost information, so they don't populate it. And you don't have to, but if you do have cost information, you should populate it. The ones that are typically missing are the observation period, the visit, the error tables. Those are all derived, and those are required in the CDM. So it's and a lot of the logic, some of the logic, like the error tables, those are actually out on the GitHub repository. And then for the observation period and the visit occurrence table, that logic is derived from the data, the source of the data that you have. So be careful when you are populating these tables, and make sure that you are populating all the tables that are necessary. And that ends our session for today. Going forward, your instructor will tell you what to do for the exercise. Thank you.